You work tirelessly, accumulate achievements, grow your bank account, and yet you feel an emptiness you can't explain to anyone. Perhaps you even take secret pride in this, in your ability to always want more, to never be satisfied. But deep down, you know something's wrong when the success you fought so hard for didn't bring the peace it promised. I am Solomon. I was the richest man who ever lived. I had enough gold to buy entire nations, wisdom that kings traveled across continents to hear, and power that made emperors bow. But today I come to you not to boast about my achievements, but to confess my greatest mistakes. Because here's the truth. I nearly lost my soul on the way to the top. And if you continue pursuing wealth the way most people do, you'll lose yours too. There are 5 hidden traps in wealth that have destroyed men stronger than you and me. Traps I fell into one by one, until they nearly turned me into a man empty inside, surrounded by gold, but dead within. The lust that consumes your vital energy, the pride that makes you deaf to your own conscience, the vanity that turns your life into a pathetic performance, the isolation that surrounds you with flatterers but leaves you without a true friend, and disguised idolatry when money becomes your new god. Today in this message, I won't just tell my story. I'll show you how to build true wealth without losing what's most valuable in you. How to become prosperous in a way that honors your purpose, protects your family, and strengthens your spirit instead of destroying it. Because the difference between a rich man and a prosperous man isn't in the size of the bank account. It's in the ability to carry the weight of wealth without letting it carry you. If you're ready for this real transformation, if you're tired of being just another person chasing money without wisdom, then follow along with this channel. Because what you'll learn here can save not just your prosperity, but your soul. Trap 1. The swift taste of lust. You know that feeling when you get something you've always wanted, but within days, you're already looking for the next conquest? Maybe it's a promotion. Maybe it's someone who finally gave in to your charm. Maybe it's that car you bought that now sits in the garage, as ordinary as any other object. There's a hunger inside you that never stops growling, no matter how much you feed it. And deep down, you know you're losing something important in this endless race for the next pleasure. I had 1,000 women. 1,000. Each one more beautiful than the last. Each bringing promises of satisfaction that would last forever. Queens, princesses, dancers, poets. Women that men would kill to have for a single night. And I had them all. Power gave me access to any desire, any fantasy, any whim that crossed my mind. If I wanted it, I only had to reach out my hand. But let me tell you a truth no one talks about regarding pleasure. When you have the power to obtain it without limits, it becomes the sweetest poison that exists. At first, each new experience seemed to confirm that I was truly blessed, truly special. Each conquest fed my ego and made me feel more alive. I believed that being surrounded by beauty and pleasure was evidence of my greatness. Lust is like a fruit that looks perfect on the outside, but when you bite into it, you discover it's rotten inside. And the tragedy is that once you taste it, you can't stop eating, even knowing you're poisoning yourself. Because lust isn't just about sex or relationships. It's about any pleasure you pursue without purpose, any stimulation you use to escape the reality of your own soul. There were nights when I was surrounded by the most desired women in the world, in palaces decorated with pure gold, eating the rarest delicacies, and I felt an emptiness so deep it physically hurt. It was as if each pleasure I experienced created a bigger hole inside me that needed to be filled with even more pleasure, and the more I tried to fill it, the bigger the hole became. Let me tell you about one specific night that changed my perspective forever. I was in my palace, surrounded by 20 of the most beautiful women in the kingdom. There was music, dancing, wine from the finest vineyards, perfumes that cost more than entire houses. Outside, thousands of people slept in the streets, hungry, while I drowned in lust. And suddenly, in the middle of all that opulence, I saw myself as if I were looking from the outside. I saw an empty man trying to fill himself with empty things. I saw someone who had so much power he could have anything, but who no longer knew who he was when alone. That night, I realized that lust had done something terrible to me. It had stolen my capacity to feel real satisfaction. Each pleasure needed to be bigger, more intense, more extreme than the previous one, because my soul was becoming numb. It was like a drug that requires increasingly larger doses to produce the same effect. And the worst part, I was using my success as an excuse for this behavior. I told myself I deserved it, that I had worked hard, that men in my position had the right to have everything. The truth no one tells you is that lust kills your productivity silently, not all at once, but drop by drop. Every bit of energy you spend pursuing pleasure without purpose is energy you don't have to build something lasting. Every moment you spend feeding superficial desires is a moment you're not cultivating your wisdom, your discipline, your character. I began to notice that my best decisions as king were made when I had control over my desires, not when I satisfied them without limits. When I fasted, when I disciplined myself, when I channeled my energy toward greater purposes, my mind became crystal clear. But when I gave in to all available pleasures, my judgment became cloudy, my priorities got confused, and I made decisions that would exact a high price in the future. The turning point came when I understood that true freedom isn't being able to do everything you want, but having the power not to do things that will destroy you. A rich man who can't say no to his own desires isn't free, he's a slave to his own appetite. And slaves don't build lasting empires. They just consume resources until everything collapses. If you want to build real and lasting wealth, you need to understand that your sexual energy, your creative energy, your life force aren't infinite resources you can waste without consequences. They're fuel for your greatness, and you need to learn to channel them toward purposes that truly matter. This doesn't mean living like a monk, but it means being intentional with your pleasures instead of being compulsive. Learn the difference between satisfaction and satiation. Satisfaction is when you experience something with presence, with gratitude, with purpose. Satiation is when you consume endlessly until you feel numb. A man satisfied with a good meal has energy to conquer the world. A man satiated with 10 meals just wants to sleep. The same applies to relationships. A man who deeply loves one woman and builds something real with her has a source of energy and stability that can move mountains. A man who collects women like trophies is just feeding his empty ego and wasting energy that could be used to build a legacy. And here's the paradox that lust hides from you. The more you give into it, the less pleasure you actually feel. Your senses become dulled, your emotions become shallow, your capacity to deeply connect with any experience diminishes. You become an emotional glutton who eats more and more but is never truly satisfied. Lust convinces you that you need constant variety to be happy. But the truth is the opposite. Depth brings more pleasure than variety. Intensity brings more satisfaction than quantity. A man who knows how to truly appreciate a single experience is more alive than a man who consumes 100 experiences without presence. Therefore, if you want to avoid this trap, start practicing what I call conscious desire. When you feel a craving, stop before acting. Ask yourself, is this desire coming from a place of creation or destruction? Will it give me energy to build something greater, or will it drain me and leave me empty? Am I seeking this because I truly want it, or because I'm running from some pain, some fear, some emptiness I don't want to face? Learn to fast from your favorite pleasures, not as punishment, but for power. A man who can voluntarily give up what he most desires is a man who has control over his own life. And control over yourself is the first step to having control over anything else. Remember, your body is the temple of your soul, and your energy is the fuel of your dreams. Every drop of energy you waste on empty pleasures is one less drop to build the life you truly want. And a man who can't manage his pleasures will never be able to manage his prosperity. Lust promises freedom, but delivers slavery. Promises life, but delivers slow death. Promises power, but delivers weakness disguised as strength. Don't be like I was for so many years, a king, powerful on the outside, but a slave to his own desires on the inside. Trap 2. The pride that makes you deaf. When was the last time you admitted you were wrong about something important? When was the last time you genuinely asked for help without trying to save face? If you're hesitating to answer, if you're searching your memory and can't find anything recent, then you're experiencing exactly what I experienced during the most dangerous years of my reign. You're becoming deaf, and you haven't even noticed yet. Pride doesn't arrive like a noisy invader breaking down your doors. It enters like a silent counselor, whispering partial truths in your ear until you confuse its voice with the voice of wisdom. It convinces you that your self-sufficiency is strength, that your independence is maturity, that your ability to solve problems alone is evidence of superiority. And so, drop by drop, you lose the ability to hear any voice but your own. I was known as the wisest man in the world. Kings traveled for months to consult me. Queens brought valuable gifts just to hear a word from me. Sages from distant nations came to sit at my feet to learn. And somehow, at some point in this journey, I began to believe that wisdom was my property, not a gift I had received. I began to confuse being a channel of wisdom with being the source of wisdom. Pride is like a cataract that grows slowly in the eyes of the soul. At first, you can still see almost everything clearly. Only some areas become slightly blurred. But over time, the cataract grows, and you lose the ability to see situations with precision, people with clarity, and especially, you lose the ability to see yourself as you really are. There was a period in my life when I stopped consulting God before making important decisions. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was something gradual. First, I began consulting less about small decisions because I thought I already knew the answer. Then, I stopped consulting about medium decisions because my experience gave me confidence. And finally, I stopped consulting about big decisions because I believed my accumulated wisdom was sufficient for any situation. What I didn't realize at the time is that wisdom, without humility, is just intelligence disguised as arrogance. And intelligence without connection to something greater than yourself is just cleverness limited by your own perspective. When you stop listening to external advice, when you stop seeking wisdom outside yourself, when you stop admitting ignorance in any area, you're not demonstrating strength, you're demonstrating a fatal weakness, the inability to grow. Let me tell you about the decision that nearly destroyed my kingdom and how pride completely blinded me to its consequences. I decided to drastically increase taxes to finance construction projects that, honestly, were more about my personal glory than the good of the people. My oldest advisors, men who had served my father with honor, came to warn me about the risks. They said the people were already overburdened, that the economy couldn't handle more pressure, that I was creating conditions for a revolt. But I could no longer hear advice that contradicted my will. My pride had created selective deafness. I could only hear voices that confirmed what I already wanted to do. So, instead of listening to the wise men who warned me, I began surrounding myself with ambitious young men who told me exactly what I wanted to hear. They assured me I was too wise to be wrong, too powerful to face real opposition, and too blessed for my decisions to bring negative consequences. The deafness of pride works like this. It doesn't prevent you from hearing sounds. It prevents you from hearing wisdom. You still hear the words people speak, but your pride acts like a filter that only lets through what confirms your superiority and blocks everything that challenges your self-image. It's as if you were in a room full of people shouting fire, but you could only hear that one person whispering, "Everything's fine." The result was exactly what my old advisors predicted. The people revolted, the economy collapsed, and my own son turned against me, dividing the kingdom in half after my death. All because I became deaf to wisdom that didn't come from inside my own head. All because I confused confidence with arrogance and wisdom with self-sufficiency. But here's what's most dangerous about pride. It convinces you that you're being wise when you're being foolish, strong when you're being weak, independent when you're being dependent on your own limitations. The proud man thinks he doesn't need anyone, but actually he's become dependent on constant validation of his own superiority. He thinks he's free, but he's become a slave, to the need to always be right. The turning point in my life came when I finally admitted I had made catastrophic mistakes. Not small mistakes I could justify or minimize, but mistakes that cost lives, that destroyed families, that divided my kingdom. It was only when my pride was broken by the reality of consequences that I could hear clearly again. And you know what I discovered when I returned to listening with humility? That there was wisdom everywhere I had ignored for years. My wife had insights about people I had never considered. My servants had observations about the economy I had never heard. My enemies had valid criticisms that contained important truths about my blind spots. Even children playing in the streets had innocent wisdom that could teach me about priorities and simplicity. When you are humble, the whole world becomes your university. Every person you meet has at least one lesson they can teach you. Every difficult situation has at least one wisdom it can give you. Every mistake you make has at least one correction that can strengthen you. But when you are proud, you become deaf to all this wealth of available knowledge, and you're limited only to what you already know. Humility is not weakness, it's strength applied with wisdom. A humble man is not a man who diminishes himself. He's a man who recognizes his real greatness without needing to inflate it with illusions. He knows his strength comes from connection with something greater than himself, and therefore he can accept help without feeling diminished, can admit ignorance without feeling embarrassed, can change his mind without feeling defeated. If you want to avoid the trap of pride, you need to cultivate what I call active listening of the soul. This means creating regular spaces in your life to hear voices other than your own. It could be through mentorship, where you deliberately put yourself in the position of a learner. It could be through honest feedback, where you ask people close to you to tell you uncomfortable truths about yourself. It could be through prayer or meditation, where you silence your own voice to hear something greater. Practice saying these 3 phrases at least once a week. I don't know, I was wrong, and I need help. Not because you're ignorant, incompetent, or weak, but because you're wise enough to know that no one knows everything, everyone makes mistakes, and even the strongest need support. Surround yourself with people who have permission to challenge you. The proud man surrounds himself with flatterers who agree with everything. The wise man surrounds himself with advisors who have the courage to disagree when necessary. If all the people around you always agree with you, it's not because you're always wise, it's because you're surrounded by people who are afraid to tell you the truth or who have an interest in keeping you blind. Remember, your individual perspective, no matter how intelligent and experienced you are, will always be limited. You can only see from where you stand, only know from what you've lived, only understand from what you've experienced. Other people have other perspectives, other experiences, other wisdom that can complete your understanding of reality. Pride promises power but delivers isolation, promises wisdom but delivers ignorance disguised as knowledge, promises independence but delivers dependence on your own limitations. Don't be like I was, a powerful king who became deaf to his own wisdom by believing he no longer needed to listen to anyone else. Trap 3. Vanity as master of your schedule. Take a look at your schedule this week. How many of your activities are for building something real and lasting in your life? And how many are for maintaining an image you want to project to the world? How many decisions do you make based on what will give you internal satisfaction? And how many do you make based on what will impress other people? If you're honest with this analysis, you'll discover something disturbing. Vanity is probably controlling more of your life than you imagine. Vanity isn't just about physical appearance or ostentatious material goods. It's a much more subtle and dangerous force that infiltrates all areas of your existence, transforming your life into a constant performance where you are simultaneously the actor, the director, and the only audience that really matters. Because, ironically, when you live to impress others, you end up being the only person who's never really impressed. During the height of my kingdom, I built projects that left the world speechless. The Temple of Jerusalem, palaces that were considered architectural wonders, hanging gardens that defied the laws of physics, entire cities planned down to the smallest details. Historians to this day speak of these constructions as evidence of my greatness. But I need to tell you the truth. Behind every stone laid, most of these works weren't built out of necessity, they were built out of vanity. The temple was necessary. It was a sacred project that honored God and served the people. But the 15 palaces I built afterward, the exotic gardens that imported plants from distant continents, the decorative cities that existed only to show my power, these were works of vanity, monuments to my own ego disguised as national greatness. Vanity works like an invisible theater director who's always whispering in your ear. How will this look to others? What impression will this make? How can I do this in a way that shows everyone how special I am? And gradually, without you realizing it, your decisions stop being based on internal values and start being based on external results. There were days when I woke up, and my first question wasn't, what do I need to do today to be a good king, a good man, a faithful servant of God? But rather, what can I do today that will have people talking about me for generations? This subtle shift in motivation transformed my life into a constant exhibition, an endless search for applause that was never enough. Let me tell you about the most vain project I ever undertook, an entire city built just to receive foreign dignitaries. I spent a fortune on gold, marble, rare spices, artists imported from other countries, just to have a place where I could impress important visitors. The city was beautiful, perfect, but completely empty of real purpose. It was like a giant theater set, created just for a performance. When the city was finished, I organized a reception to show off the work. Kings, queens, Ambassador Saul came to admire what I had built. And I remember being in the middle of all that admiration, hearing praise about my vision, my power, my greatness, and feeling nothing, absolute emptiness. Because I knew deep in my soul that the entire work was just a desperate cry for validation, disguised as greatness. Vanity is like a drug that requires increasingly larger doses to produce the same effect. First, you're satisfied with a sincere compliment about something you actually did well. Then you need multiple compliments. Then you need compliments about increasingly grandiose things. And finally, you're creating artificial situations just to generate admiration for things that have no real value in your life. The most tragic part is that while you're living to impress others, you're losing precious time to build things that actually matter. Every hour I spent planning vain constructions was an hour I didn't spend with my family. Every resource I invested in ego projects was a resource I didn't invest in my people's welfare. Every bit of energy I directed toward maintaining appearances was energy I didn't direct toward real personal growth. Vanity gradually steals your authenticity. You start by modifying small behaviors to make a better impression. Then, you start modifying your opinions to align with what's popular. Next, you modify your values to fit what's expected. And finally, you look in the mirror and no longer recognize who's looking back, because you've become a performative version of yourself. There was a specific moment when this reality hit me with full force. I was alone in my private gardens, those expensive gardens that were made to impress visitors. But there were no visitors that day. It was just me, walking among exotic plants that cost fortunes, ornamental fountains that took years to build, pavilions decorated with pure gold. And suddenly I asked myself, if no one were watching, if no one were ever going to see this, would I still have built all of this? The answer was a devastating no. I realized I had spent decades of my life and immense resources creating things that only had value if other people saw them and praised me for them. I had built an entire kingdom facing outward, but had completely neglected my inner kingdom. Vanity convinces you that others' opinion of you is more important than your own opinion of yourself. And so, you gradually outsource your self-esteem, handing control of your happiness over to people who, most of the time, are so busy with their own lives that they barely pay attention to yours. The turning point came when I began asking myself, if I died today, what real difference did I make in people's lives? Beyond the impression I made, what true impact did I leave? And the answer was humbling. I had impressed crowds but hadn't deeply touched almost any individual lives. I had built monuments to my greatness but hadn't built meaningful relationships. I had created memorable spectacles but hadn't created precious memories with those I truly loved. I learned there's a fundamental difference between real greatness and performative greatness. Real greatness is when you do something excellent because it's the right thing to do, regardless of who's watching. Performative greatness is when you do something just because you want others to see it and consider you excellent. If you want to free yourself from the tyranny of vanity, you need to start doing good things that no one will ever know you did. Help someone anonymously. Solve a problem without taking credit. Develop a skill without telling anyone. Do charitable works without publicizing them. This will reconnect you with real internal satisfaction, which doesn't depend on external validation. Learn to distinguish between healthy admiration and vain admiration. Healthy admiration is when you genuinely appreciate someone's excellence and are inspired to improve. Vain admiration is when you want to be admired just for the ego, without connection to real purpose. Start making decisions based on the question, is this important to me, or just important to my image? If you'd only do something when other people are watching, it's probably vanity. If you do it even if no one ever knew, it's probably real value. Cultivate relationships where you can be vulnerable and imperfect. Vanity thrives in environments where you always need to appear flawless, but authentic relationships require you to be real, flaws and all. And when you discover you can be loved and respected even while being imperfect, the need to perform perfection dramatically decreases. Remember, your life isn't a theater play where you need to impress an audience. It's a personal journey where the only applause that really matters is from your own conscience when you lay your head on the pillow, knowing you lived with integrity. Vanity promises admiration but delivers loneliness, promises greatness but delivers superficiality, promises satisfaction but delivers a hunger that can never be satisfied. Don't spend your life building houses of cards to impress people who are too busy building their own houses of cards to really care about yours. Trap 4. The isolation that kills strong kings. How many people in your life have real permission to tell you that you're wrong? How many can confront you when you're being unfair, question you when you're being foolish, correct you when you're being proud? If you're thinking now and the number that comes to mind is 0, or very close to 0, then you're walking toward the same emotional desert where I lived for years. The isolation of the soul disguised as power and independence. When you accumulate wealth and power, something strange happens to your relationships. People start treating you differently, not necessarily because you've changed, but because the dynamic has changed. They start weighing their words when they speak to you, filtering their opinions, saying what they think you want to hear instead of what they really think. And you gradually lose access to the truth about yourself through the eyes of others. At the beginning of my journey as king, I had true friends. Men who had grown up with me, who knew me before I had any power, who could laugh at my jokes without forcing laughter, who could disagree with me without fear, who loved me for the person I was, not for the position I held. These men were my war companions, my advisors in the early years, my soul brothers in every sense. But as my wealth grew, as my power expanded, as my fame spread, something subtle began to happen. These true friends started behaving slightly differently in my presence. Not that they stopped loving me, but they began treating me with a reverence that created a small but real distance between us. The isolation of wealth doesn't happen all at once. It's like slow erosion. First, you notice that people agree with you a little more easily than before. Then, you notice they hesitate slightly before expressing contrary opinions. Next, you observe that conversations stop when you enter the room, not out of malice, but out of deference. And finally, you realize you're surrounded by people, but profoundly alone. The loneliness of the rich is different from the loneliness of the poor. The poor person may be alone, but he knows it's because there's no one around. The rich person is surrounded by people, but alone because no one is really close. It's a crueler loneliness because it comes disguised as popularity, an emotional hunger masked as social abundance. Let me tell you about the day this reality hit me with devastating force. It was my birthday, and hundreds of important people came to honor me. Expensive gifts, eloquent speeches, laughter at the right moments, unanimous approval for every word I said. But in the middle of all that celebration, I had a strange feeling. There wasn't a single person in that room who I felt really knew me. I began to test this feeling. During the following weeks, I deliberately expressed controversial opinions, made questionable decisions, said obviously wrong things, just to see if anyone would confront me. And the result was frightening. People found creative ways to agree with me even when I was clearly wrong, to support me even when I was being unfair, to praise me even when I was being ridiculous. That's when I realized I had unknowingly created a social prison around myself, a prison made of deference, flattery, fear, and self-interest. People weren't lying to me out of malice. They were lying out of self-preservation, courtesy, hope of gaining something, or simply because they thought that's what I wanted to hear. The tragedy of the powerful person's isolation is that you gradually lose the ability to see yourself clearly. Your flaws are hidden or minimized. Your mistakes are justified or ignored. Your weaknesses are disguised or denied. And without that honest mirror that true relationships provide, you lose touch with your own reality. I began to miss being confronted, being challenged, having someone tell me, "Solomon, you're being an idiot," when I really was being one. I missed conversations where I wasn't treated as a supreme authority, but as a common human being who could be right or wrong about anything. Wealth creates invisible walls around you, not physical walls, but emotional walls that prevent genuine connections. People start relating to your position, your wealth, your power, instead of relating to you. And you, in turn, start suspecting all intentions, questioning all motives, wondering if anyone would be close to you if you lost everything tomorrow. This constant suspicion creates a vicious cycle. The more you doubt people's intentions, the more you close yourself off. The more you close yourself off, the more artificial people become in your presence. The more artificial they become, the more reasons you have to be suspicious. And so you build your own emotional prison, brick by brick. The lowest point came when I realized I had no one I could be vulnerable with. No one to whom I could confess fears, doubts, insecurities. No one with whom I could cry without it being interpreted as political weakness. No one to whom I could admit I didn't know something without it affecting my reputation as wise. Vulnerability is the price of real intimacy. And when you can't be vulnerable, you can't have real intimacy. And without real intimacy, you live in an elaborate version of loneliness, surrounded by people who know your public image but not your private soul. It was then that I made a radical decision. I deliberately sought out people who had nothing to gain from me. Old servants who had been loyal for decades, children who didn't understand politics, foreigners who didn't care about my local power, holy men who despised material wealth. With these people, I began practicing transparency, vulnerability, humanity. The result was transformative. I rediscovered the pleasure of a conversation where I wasn't treated as infallible. I felt again the joy of genuine laughter, not forced by courtesy. I experienced once more the peace of being accepted with flaws and all, instead of being admired for a polished version of myself. I learned that true strength isn't never needing anyone. It's having people you can trust when you need them. Real independence isn't being isolated. It's having healthy relationships where you choose to be close out of love, not out of necessity. Authentic power isn't having people who agree with everything you say. It's having people who respect you enough to disagree when necessary. If you want to avoid this trap, you need to deliberately cultivate relationships where you're not the center, not the authority, not the main beneficiary. Relationships where you serve more than you're served, where you listen more than you speak, where you learn more than you teach. Keep people in your life who knew you before you had any significant success. They're your anchors to reality, who can remind you of who you were before all the achievements and can love you independently of all your possessions. Practice being the helper, not the helped. Serve in places where you're just another volunteer. Participate in activities where your skills are common, not exceptional. This keeps you connected to common humanity and prevents you from isolating yourself in a bubble of exceptionality. Create safe spaces for vulnerability. This could be through therapy, small groups, intimate friendships, where you can express doubts, fears, weaknesses without judgment. These spaces are oxygen for the soul and antidote against isolation. Remember, no man is an island, not even kings. Your greatest riches aren't your possessions, but your relationships. Your greatest powers aren't your abilities, but your connections. Your greatest security isn't in what you own, but in who truly loves you. Isolation promises protection but delivers prison, promises control but delivers disconnection, promises superiority but delivers loneliness disguised as greatness. Don't be like I was, a powerful king who became a prisoner of his own crown. Trap 5. Idolatry disguised as discipline. When you pray asking for prosperity, are you genuinely seeking God's will for your life? Or are you asking for divine blessing on your own already decided plans? When you make business decisions, do you consult eternal principles for guidance? Or do you use eternal principles to justify choices you've already made for other reasons? If these questions bother you, if they touch a wound you'd prefer not to examine, then you may be experiencing the most subtle and dangerous of all wealth traps: idolatry disguised as spirituality. This isn't the obvious idolatry of ancient peoples who carved golden idols and bowed before them. This is refined, sophisticated idolatry that disguises itself as devotion while secretly placing money on the throne of the heart. It's when you continue using the language of faith, but gold has become your true God, your plans have become your true scripture, and your control has become your true religion. At the height of my wealth, I was externally the most religious man in the kingdom. I built the most magnificent temple in history, offered sacrifices that impressed entire nations, wrote songs that are sung to this day, spoke wisdom that's quoted as sacred scripture. But behind all this appearance of piety, something terrible was happening. I was using God as a consultant for my business, instead of being an obedient servant of divine will. Modern idolatry of money is extremely difficult to detect because it doesn't openly reject God. On the contrary, it incorporates God into its plans, but always in a secondary role. God becomes the supplier of the blessings you want, the approver of the projects you've already decided to do, the guarantor of success for the ventures you've already chosen to pursue. Let me tell you how this transformation happened in my life, because it was so gradual I didn't even notice while it was happening. At first, I genuinely sought divine guidance for every important decision. I fasted, prayed, waited for signs, consulted prophets, sought wisdom before acting. My decisions were based on what I believed to be God's will, even when it contradicted my personal desires. But as my wealth grew, and my projects became bigger and more complex, I began to subtly modify this process. Instead of seeking guidance before making decisions, I began seeking confirmation after I had already decided. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" I began asking, "How can I do what I want in a way that will be blessed?" The first major decision where I used faith to justify disguised ambition was when I decided to expand my kingdom through marriage alliances with pagan nations. I knew this was contrary to the principles I had received, but I found ways to rationalize. It would be wise diplomacy, bring peace, expand influence, could even be a way to evangelize other nations through example. Spiritual rationalization is one of the most dangerous forms of self-deception that exists. It's when you use sacred truths to validate profane desires, when you twist eternal principles to justify temporary conveniences, when you make God a junior partner in your enterprises, instead of making yourself a faithful servant of divine purposes. What happened next was a downward spiral of compromises. One marriage alliance led me to tolerate pagan practices. Tolerating pagan practices led me to participate in pagan rituals. Participating in pagan rituals led me to build temples for pagan gods. And building temples for pagan gods led me to worship these gods as a way to maintain political and commercial alliances. But in all these steps, I maintained a spiritual narrative that justified my actions. I wasn't abandoning my faith. I was being pragmatic. I wasn't worshiping other gods. I was being diplomatic. I wasn't disobeying. I was interpreting wisdom in a more sophisticated way. Idolatry was happening, but disguised as advanced spiritual strategy. Money idolatry works exactly like this. It doesn't ask you to deny God. It asks you to transform God into a means to an end, instead of being He Himself the end. Your prayers become wish lists for financial success. Your faith becomes a tool to attract prosperity. Your principles become flexible guidelines that can be adapted according to business convenience. There was a specific moment when the reality of my idolatry hit me with devastating force. I was in the temple I had built for God, offering expensive sacrifices, surrounded by pure gold. But my heart was completely focused on a business negotiation that would happen the next day. I realized I was physically in the most sacred place in the world, but mentally worshiping at the altar of profit. In that moment, I understood that my heart had become like a house with many rooms, where God had permission to stay in a guest room, but gold had moved into the master bedroom. I still visited God regularly, still treated Him with respect, still consulted Him occasionally, but He was no longer the master of the house. He was just a respected tenant. Disguised idolatry is dangerous because it preserves all the external forms of spirituality while emptying their real content. You continue praying, but your prayers become negotiations. You continue studying sacred principles, but only to find validation for decisions you've already made. You continue talking about faith, but your true faith is deposited in your ability to generate and control wealth. The simplest test to detect this idolatry is to ask yourself, if you lost all your wealth tomorrow but kept your faith, would you feel blessed or cursed? If the answer is cursed, then your faith was really based on wealth, not on something greater than wealth. Another test is to examine your financial decisions. Are they made first based on eternal principles and then adapted to practical realities? Or are they made first based on practical convenience and then justified with eternal principles? The order of this sequence reveals where your loyalty really lies. The turning point in my life came when I made a prayer of brutal, total honesty. I stopped trying to impress God with beautiful words, stopped trying to negotiate with Him, stopped trying to convince Him of my plans. I simply confessed, I made gold my God. I used you as a consultant for my projects instead of being a servant of your purposes. I worshipped my own ability to generate wealth more than I worshipped you. This confession was liberating and devastating at the same time. Liberating because I finally stopped living in the lie that I was spiritual while being idolatrous. Devastating because I realized how many important decisions I had made based on wrong motivations, how many opportunities for true obedience I had lost by being focused on opportunities for profit. From that moment, I had to relearn how to make decisions. Instead of starting with, how can I prosper? And then seeking spiritual validation, I began to ask, what's the right thing to do? And accept whatever financial consequences came with it. This didn't mean neglecting practical responsibilities, but it meant reordering priorities so that eternal principles had supremacy over temporary conveniences. If you want to avoid this trap, you need to cultivate what I call authentic reverent fear. This means recognizing that there's a moral order in the universe that's greater than your personal plans, and that your prosperity must submit to this order, not the other way around. Practice making financial decisions that honor eternal principles even when it costs money in the short term. If you only honor principles when they're financially convenient, then money is your true principle. Keep areas of your life where God has total authority, where you obey regardless of financial consequences. This could be through sacrificial generosity, through costly ethical decisions, through priorities that place relationships above profits. Remember, you can have wealth without being possessed by it, can prosper without making money your God, can be successful without compromising your soul. But this only happens when you keep wealth in its appropriate place, as a tool for greater purposes, not as the purpose itself. Idolatry promises control but delivers anxiety. Promises security but delivers constant fear of loss. Promises freedom but delivers slavery disguised as success. Don't be like I was, a man who had everything money could buy, but who almost lost everything money cannot buy. I spent decades building a kingdom of gold, but almost lost my soul in the process. Today, when I look back, I see that the 5 traps I shared with you weren't just obstacles in my path. They were mirrors that reflected who I really was inside. Each trap I fell into revealed a part of me I didn't want to admit existed. Wealth is like a powerful river. It can irrigate entire gardens and give life to civilizations, but it can also sweep away entire houses if you don't know how to navigate its currents. The difference between prospering and drowning isn't in the amount of water, but in the wisdom of whoever's holding the rudder. You who listened to me until here, you who had the courage to look at your own traps while I confessed mine, you've already begun a journey that few men have the courage to take. Because recognizing the traps is the first step to avoiding them. Admitting vulnerability is the first step to finding real strength. Your prosperity doesn't need to cost your soul. Your success doesn't need to cost your peace. Your wealth doesn't need to cost your relationships. But this only happens when you carry wisdom along with your wealth, when you cultivate character along with your bank account. If this conversation touched something deep in you, if these reflections awakened questions you need to continue exploring, then come walk with me on this journey. Follow along and allow these truths to continue echoing in your life. Because a man who knows his traps will never be defeated by them.